Let's suppose that there's a vast, hugely powerful force that nobody can withstand. And this immense force is always active and in furious motion. It never rests. It's like a slowly flowing river that can eventually carve the Grand Canyon out of solid rock. But that comparison doesn't really do it justice. The force I'm talking about is much more formidable than any river or ocean or glacier or any other natural phenomenon. Now, in trying to achieve your life's goals, would you prefer to fight against this great force? Would you want to struggle against this mighty power that has all the odds overwhelmingly in its favor? Or would you rather enlist this great power in your cause and make the inevitable work for you instead of against you? Take your time before answering. Think it over. By the way, time is that great power I'm talking about. Time is the mightiest force in the world, or even in the universe. Of course, the answer to the question I posed is very obvious. Why would you ever choose to fight time when you could have time on your side? Who wouldn't want to harness the great river of time that flows through all of life? Why wouldn't you want to use the power of time to generate power in every area of your existence, to turn the turbines of your hopes and dreams, to charge your every aspiration with lightning bolts of electricity? Well, there is only one way to make time work for you, not against you, and that's with patience. There have been some items in the news lately about changes in the climate, global warming, and so forth, and how the level of the seas will rise during the coming years and put whole communities under water that now stand high and dry. All I can tell you is that in certain parts of the country, it's been plenty hot and dry the last few summers, and I'm sure there have been times when the residents of those areas would have liked to have seen some big ocean waves come rolling across the plains. Think for a moment about any state that's in the middle of this continent, away from the coast, and ponder this question. What do you suppose it would take to turn that state into a kind of surfer's paradise? So when it gets hot, you could just go out and let the waves cool you off. For example, what would you need in order to turn Texas into California? If you take the perspective of an engineer, you'd maybe think about the water rights, the dams, and all the good stuff you'd need. The kind of undertaking that would make the Hoover Dam and Lake Mead look like a little inflatable backyard swimming pool. From that perspective, the whole notion's not only impractical, it's impossible. But if you believe everything that's been written about global warming and rising water, you realize that it isn't really an impossible proposition. In fact, some people are saying it's inevitable. You don't need any water rights or dams to see it happen either. All you need is patience. Here's another illustration of the power of patience. Imagine you're at a cottage in New England when a blizzard hits. There's more snow in less time than any other winter on record. If you went to bed in the middle of this blizzard, you'd probably assume that when you got up, you'd have to shovel the drifts away from the front door just to get down the steps. You may even think about getting started on the work before you go to bed. But in this case, as it turns out, all that bedtime effort wouldn't have been necessary. Overnight, the wind keeps blowing, and while you sleep, it shifts around 180 degrees, so all the snow on your front porch is cleared away naturally. You don't have to knock yourself out with a shovel. You may be saving yourself from a stiff back or a heart attack, and all you had to do was wait. Patience. There's a type of person for whom everything is undertaken out of desire to achieve a goal. They prepare food in order to eat it, not just for the fun of being in the kitchen. They start a business in order to make money. They exercise in order to get in shape. I'm sure that some of these people are very successful, and they are certainly highly organized. But in my opinion, a person of truly strong character sees success as an adventure, not as a point with an estimated time of arrival. The latter approach to me is impatient thinking. Impatient thinking can lead a person into some very big mistakes. First of all, when you are always looking somewhere else, whether it's down the road or up toward the top of the mountain or off toward the left field fence, where you're hoping to hit that grand slam home run, when you're looking off in the distance like that, you often miss what's under your very own nose. That means the pleasure and fun of living which come in the here and now get overlooked for something that not only isn't here yet, but might never arrive. True patience is more than just a waiting game. Patience doesn't mean you sit around hoping for something to happen. Patience is not a passive quality. Sometimes patience can mean doing something else entirely, thinking about another venture, taking off in a different direction, while you give events a chance to run their course. A colleague of mine told me this story. He was traveling cross-country on a speaking tour and found himself delayed in Chicago while changing planes. In the first-class traveler's lounge, he fell into conversation with a gentleman who actually looked a bit like John Wayne during his true grit period. And he was a little surprised to learn this gentleman was actually from New York City. And there was another surprise. Despite his rough-hewn appearance, this fellow traveler proved to be extremely soft-spoken. His favorite pastime was playing chess. But as he talked about his experiences in the construction business in New York City, he also demonstrated that he carried a big stick. His company had developed some of the most important commercial real estate in Manhattan. As successful people always do when they encounter other successful individuals, my colleague asked him how he'd done it. Well, he said, after I got my engineering degree, I spent some years getting hands-on experience in construction. I didn't want to be supervising people in any jobs that I didn't know how to do myself. Later on, when I started putting together my own projects, I had to deal with some pretty tough streetwise operators. Cement company guys, building inspectors, trucking companies. But I never tried to pretend I was any kind of hard case myself. I used to tell them right up front, you play straight with me, and I'll play straight with you. I never tried to take advantage of anybody, but I never let anyone take advantage of me either. You see, I always was, and I still am, a great counter-puncher. Anybody who takes a shot at me in business had better make sure it's a good one, because I'm going to hit back hard. But it's like chess. You don't necessarily hit back right away. You have to be patient. You have to wait for the right moment. You have to let the other guy know, okay, you had your chance. Next time it's my turn. But you don't say that out loud. You don't say what you've got in mind, and you don't say when it might be coming. You just go on, polite and friendly as ever. You don't ever let on that you're waiting for an opening. But you rest assured that your chance will come. It's like any other investment. It takes patience. Patience is the key. Needless to say, those several hours between flights were both informative and enjoyable for my colleague. And we can all learn from this story. Don't concentrate on things you can't influence, like when the planes are going to take off. Instead, focus on things you can control, And when you meet somebody you can learn from, then learn everything you can while you've got the chance. You never know when you're going to come across a book or an article that will provide a piece of information that can transform your life. One thing is for sure, however, and I've said this many times, the book you don't read isn't going to help. And it's the same with meeting people. You never know who is going to be able to teach you exactly what you need to know. Even if you don't need to know it now, you might need to know it at some point in the future. That might not be for 15 years, but it might just be in 15 minutes, too. A number of years ago, there was a movie out. I think it was called Being There. And it was the story of a not very bright man who worked all his life as a gardener, but who through a series of comical coincidences became an advisor to the President of the United States. Now, whenever the President asked this gardener his opinion on anything, he would always answer in terms of what he knew, which of course was gardening. But the President wouldn't realize that he was talking about gardening at all. Instead, the President was sure he was speaking in metaphors and allegories, that he was making wise analogies between the world of nature and the world of human affairs. Now, I value straight speaking as much as the next man, maybe more than the next man, and I don't want to take up your time with figures of speech that might belong to a poem or a play or a movie. But with respect to the topic of patience and its role in building a strong character, I do think that gardens have lessons to teach us all, lessons about sowing and reaping, about tending and keeping. For example, there's a story about W.C. Fields, the old Hollywood comedian. Fields bought himself an unusual type of cactus called a century plant. It's called a century plant because it blooms so rarely that it seems like it only happens once every 100 years, although in fact the time is much shorter. Anyway, Fields had purchased a century plant from a florist who was either misinformed or not entirely honest, because he told the comedian that the century plant was just about to burst into bloom. And wasn't that an exciting thing? It apparently excited W.C. Fields because the notoriously cheap comedian agreed to pay top dollar for the rare treat of seeing the century plant produce a flower. Well, Fields invited all of his friends over to his house to witness the historic event. The company arrived, food and drink was served, and all eyes were on the plant, but no flower was forthcoming. Finally, outraged and embarrassed by the uncooperative cactus, Fields took a riding crop and began to furiously thrash the plant, all the while he was shouting, "Bloom, you fool, bloom!" This was a situation, and there are a lot of them, where you can try anything you want in order to hurry things up, but things just aren't going to hurry. In fact, there's only one thing that will work, and that is patience. It's strange, but young people have a much more difficult time with patience than people who have more experience in the world. It seems like the older people get, the more able they are to wait, despite the fact that sometimes they have considerably less time to wait in. You could argue that older people ought to learn how to act quickly and decisively, while younger people need to learn how to wait. When you're young, you really have just about all the time in the world, and you just can't wait to use it. For a young person to have patience is a rare and powerful thing. How can we explain that impatience of the young? Maybe it's because when you're a teenager or in your early 20s, 1 year seems like a very long time. 5 years seems like forever, and 10 years is almost more than you can possibly imagine. But more mature individuals can actually look back 10 or 20 or even 30 years, and they can use the knowledge they've gained to create patience and a sense of perspective. At the risk of confusing you, I'm going to make what may sound like a contradictory statement. Here it is. A patient man is always richer than an impatient one, even if the patient man has less money. What do I mean by that statement? Well, riches and wealth can take other forms besides dollars and cents. Okay, that sounds good. So in what sense is the patient man richer? The actual answer is very simple. A patient man is always richer than the impatient one because the patient man can always afford to wait. The patient man is never desperate. The patient man has time to spare, while the man in a hurry is always on the verge of bankruptcy as far as time is concerned. In any situation you can think of, impatience is a source of weakness and fear, while patience is substance and strength. And here's another way that patience gives the person who has it an incalculable advantage over the person who doesn't, and gives him deeper insight into himself and others, which is a mark of great character. If you can only see the short term, if you can only think in terms of the here and now, then you are like a man with one eye. You can't judge distances. You live in a world that's flat and two-dimensional. In other words, the impatient person lacks all sense of perspective. Perspective lets you measure your plans and current events against things that have already occurred and also against your desires and aspirations for the future. Then and now, here and there, near and far, need and know, watch and wait. These are the dual optics that allow the patient man to see in stereo, where the nearsighted person sees only the present, or the dreamer sees only an imaginary future, and more likely than not, trips over his mistakes trying to get there. The history of this century can tell us a great deal about the value of patience and perspective. History proves that time is the strongest ally you can possibly have, no matter what the odds against you or the level of adversity you're facing. Time gives strength to those who have it on their side. This truth was very convincingly demonstrated over the course of World War II. Germany had enormous successes in the early years of the war, with the Blitzkrieg, the surprise lightning strike from the air and land without warning that was used first against Poland and later against the countries of Western Europe. Japan also used surprise attacks successfully and almost gained a decisive advantage with the treacherous bombing of the unsuspecting American fleet at Pearl Harbor. But the nations that were allied against Germany and Japan knew that time was on their side, and they were prepared to be patient. There's no area of human activity that requires more patience than raising children. If you haven't got patience when you start out in this, you're going to have to learn it one way or the other. A baby is born after 9 months. If the future mother is tired of pregnancy before the time has expired, well, that's too bad, because there's still 2 months to go, whether she likes it or not. And when the child does arrive, he or she grows and develops at a pace that's quite beyond the parent's control. Parents who try to force a child's development are asking for trouble. And this is one point on which psychology and common sense are in complete agreement. We've all heard of parents who think they can create another Einstein by giving their 2-year-old a book on astrophysics, or that if a child is made to play the piano for an hour a day, it will bring about the second coming of Mozart. None of this works, of course, and it also ignores the fact that all real prodigies developed completely according to their own timetables. And even then, the result was usually not exactly what one might have hoped for. Mozart, for example, had a very difficult later life, and he died young, in part because he grew up so much sooner than other children. He never really had a childhood, and at 30 he was already an old man. Anyway, it doesn't take textbooks on physics or hours of music or any other kind of force to teach something effectively to children. It just takes one thing. It takes patience. It may seem like a callous comparison, but there's a sense in which raising children is like any other investment. So much depends on when you need to cash in your chips. If you're in a hurry, if you need to see results tomorrow, You're putting a lot of pressure on everybody, and there's likely to be a great deal of disappointment. But if you can afford to wait, you can ride out the hard times and eventually realize a profit.